Galaxy Fighter. This lesson is called the settings. In the options, the user can make some settings. He can choose to use the accelerometer or not. If he chooses to use the accelerometer, he can change the tilt angle so that he can play, for instance, when lying in bed. Let's go to Xcode and make this happen. We are inside Xcode. Our task is to add settings for the accelerometer and the tilt angle. Our plan is to use a slider for the tilt angle and a checkbox for the accelerometer. We have 5 new images: checkbox off.png and checkbox on.png, which are used for the checkbox, and slider line.png, slider top.png, and iPhone.png, which are used for the slider. 3 classes are affected: common, where we introduce some new constants; global handler, in which we introduce 2 new stub properties that will be used by the options layer; and the options layer, that will hold the slider and the checkbox. Let's take a look at our starting point. Here are our images: checkbox off, checkbox on, slider line, slider top, and iPhone. Let's look at our code, the common class. Here we have our new constants. Note the 2 constants slider mid-x and slider width. Slider mid-x determines where the center of our slider will be along the x-axis. The slider width determines the width of the slider. Observe also the 2 constants use accelerometer and don't use accelerometer. They will be used for determining if the game will be accelerometer enabled or not. Let's take a look at the global handler, the interface part. Here we introduce 2 new properties: a float called tilt angle and an integer called accelerometer. Let's also look at the implementation part. Here we have 2 stub methods that just return 2 fixed values for our 2 properties. Later, when we introduce persistence, we will change those 2 methods so that they return the real values. Let's now take a look at the options layer, the interface part. Here we have 3 groups of instance variables. The first group declares variables that have to do with managing the checkbox. The second group with variables that have to do with handling the slider. And the third group with variables that control the touches on the slider. Let's go to the implementation part. In the jump bar, you can see that we have grouped our methods in several groups: initialization, setup slider, setup accelerometer, setup labels, touches, and convenience methods. Let's begin with the init method. First, we are touch enabling our layer. Then we call a method that sets up the slider, and a method that sets up the accelerometer checkbox, and finally a method that sets up the labels. Let's begin with setting up the slider. First, we set up the slider line. Our slider is small to begin with, so we have to scale it. We do it by dividing the wanted slider width with the current width of the slider line. When setting up the slider button, we fetch the current value from the global handler. Then we use the method X for tilt angle to get the position for the button. When we set up the iPhone, we use the method tilt angle to get the rotation for the iPhone. Let's now take a look at set up accelerometer box method. First, we create two menu items called checkbox on and checkbox off. We add them to the toggle item and name the selector accelerometer choice. Then we add the toggle item to the menu. And finally, we call set initial value accelerometer box method. That method gets the current accelerometer value from the global handler and updates the checkbox. When the user clicks on the checkbox, the accelerometer choice method is invoked, which toggles the checkbox and updates the accelerometer value in the global handler. Let's now look at set labels method. It sets up two labels, a tilt angle with certain position and use accelerometer with certain position. The actual work is done by the set label method that adds the given label to the layer. Let's now look at the touches methods, which control the slider. In touches begin, we first check if the touch is inside the slider button. If it is, we set slider movable to yes, and remember the touched location and the slider button position. In touches moved, we first check if slider movable is true. If not, we return. Otherwise, we move the slider along the slider line and adjust the iPhone's rotation. In touches ended, we also check if slider movable is true. If not, we return. Otherwise, we set slider movable to false and update the global handler's tilt angle value. Up here we have some convenience methods that translate given tilt angle into an X position for the slider value and the other way around. That's everything, so let's test this.